Confession has a lot of perhaps religious baggage that throughout the centuries, that confession means something that it does mean, but the Bible has a very broad meaning of what it means to confess. So we're going to talk about that. The word for confession in the Greek is homologeo. That's your Greek lesson for this week. Anybody say homologeo? You got to speak Greek. Wow. Well, homologeo is made of two words. The first word is homa, or homo, actually. Homo means same. And logeo is from the word logos. It means word or spoken. So it means to say the same thing. And that means to be in agreement. In other words, it's not being deceptive. It's this idea of this heartfelt, a profound heartfelt acknowledgement. To be in agreement with yourself, to be in agreement with reality, and to be in agreement with God. It's something that's very profound. It's not deceptive. It's not this, it's this heartfelt acknowledgement of what is true. And in the Bible, there's basically three different ways that we, as people who believe in God, we confess. So in the confusion of our weakness, in the confusion of everybody else's weakness, which kind of clouds things up, and the midst of what could be a lot of deception in this world, God has given us this gift. It is the gift of speaking the truth, of speaking reality, of being in agreement with what God has done. The first way we confess is by giving a praise to God. We confess the goodness and we confess the greatness of God and of who He is. We just got done doing that. Just a few moments giving praise to God. Psalm 35:28 says this, My tongue will proclaim your righteousness, your praises all day long. It is a joy and a comfort to lose yourself in worship and to focus on God. There's this story, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a good story. 1990, now if you put a date on there, it has to be true, right? Well, in 1990, in Kansas City, Missouri, at the Kansas City Plaza, a woman entered the Haagen-Dazs ice cream store and got an ice cream cone. When she got her ice cream cone, she paid the person at the cashier. She turned around, and there standing next to her was Paul Newman. Paul Newman was in the city because he was working on the movie Mr. and Mrs. Bridge. She was stunned. Her legs almost buckled. She's a big Paul Newman fan. And I guess he's got those blue eyes. Is that right? I get him and Robert Redford mixed up all the time. They look just alike. There was Paul Newman. So her knees almost buckled. She was speechless. She finally gathered herself enough to put her change bag in her purse, and she walked out of the ice cream store. She's walking down the street, still stunned, and she realized she doesn't have her ice cream cone. So she walks back to the store, and as she's coming back into the store, Paul Newman is coming out. And he said, "Hi, hello," and she was speechless. He said, "I bet you're looking for your ice cream cone." And she was still speechless. She kind of nodded yes. And he said, "Well, you put it in your purse with your change." Okay. She lost herself in the presence of Paul Newman. How much more should we lose ourselves as we worship God? It's a wonderful time to forget about our worries, to forget about our concerns, and to focus on God and how good He is and His greatness. Now, you can always pick up your worries when you're done. They'll still be there if you want them to be. Hopefully they won't be there. But when I worship God, I put myself in a place where I can experience Him. Because He comes to us when we worship. And the strength of my weaknesses are diminished when I experience God. In the Old Testament people, they didn't have a lot of video stuff. Didn't have a lot of PowerPoint, didn't have a lot of special effects. So they worked really hard to create these visual images, that this poetry and this And the wording of their stories and of their psalms is just very image-oriented. That's pretty cool. It's a little harder work than having someone do all that for you. But in the Old Testament, Psalm 22:3, it says this. It says, "Yet you are holy, O you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel." Now the word therefore, "are enthroned," can also be translated inhabit. You inhabit the praises of your people. I think this is the image that's being created there. That for the ancient person, there was nothing more fabulous, more spectacular than to be in the presence of a king. Especially to be in the throne room of a king, where the king is sitting on the throne in all of his majesty, with his crown, his scepter, and his garments, to be in the presence of a king. So what this image is saying to us, that as we worship, as the people of Israel, as they worshiped, it was like their worship created this throne room, and created this throne, where their God Yahweh would come, and he would sit in their presence. They would be in the presence of their king as they worship. That's a pretty cool image, isn't it? When we worship God, he comes and he's with us. It's like we're creating this throne for him to sit in the midst of us. It doesn't matter if we're in the greatest cathedral ever made by man, or if we're at Primo's Banquet Hall in Convention Conference Center. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to God. God is enthroned upon our praises and our worship. So next time we worship, there's many ways to worship. Think about that God is here, that our worship creates a throne for God, and he comes and he's with us. And when he is with us, as I said before, the strength of our weakness and the power of weaknesses upon us is diminished. Psalm 13:6 says, "I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." Psalm 47:6 says, "Sing praises to God, sing praises to our King, sing praises." 77 times in the book of Psalms, which Psalms does mean songs, so it makes sense. 77 times in the book of Psalms, we are exhorted to sing praises to God. So I encourage you, as we sing praises to God on Sunday morning, that you enter in with your whole heart. Lay aside your thoughts and your concerns and how much money you have in your bank account, how many bills are sitting on your desk. They'll still be there if you want to worry about them afterwards. Hopefully you won't, though. Your job and all those other things. And enter into his presence. Because as we worship him, he is with us. And we have communion with him. We are remade. We are renewed. And the strength of our weaknesses are diminished. And we can have the good life that God has for us. Secondly, not only do I confess the goodness of God in worship, but I confess that Jesus is Lord. One of the earliest confessions of the early church. One of the earliest statements of faith, that Jesus is Lord. Romans 10:9 says this, "If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." This is the basic understanding of Christianity. Jesus is Lord. There are no other lords. It's a confession that says that my exclusive allegiance is to Christ Jesus. Now, when Paul wrote this, he was in a very pluralistic society. There were many gods. And to think that there was one God, and my one God discounts all other gods, that was seen as being incredibly unreasonable, narrow-minded, and inconsiderate. What, does that ring a bell or something? I don't know. In fact, not only was it considered inconsiderate, at times it was illegal. In the year 253, the Roman emperor's name was Valerian, and he had an edict that made all Christian clergy were required to sacrifice to the gods. You see, Rome wasn't doing that well. They were struggling in their economy, and struggling with their border wars, and they were having difficulties and rebellions. And so, being the good politician Valerian was, he diagnosed the problem. Just like we have politicians diagnosing the problem today. The problem was the gods were angry because all these Christians, they weren't worshiping the gods. And they were angry, and so Rome was in decline. And so he was going to solve it by making all the Christians, all the clergy, and you always go for the top, right? You always go for the leaders, to make them worship the gods. To go into a pagan temple, to bow the knee, and to worship the gods. In the beginning, the penalty was banishment from the empire. But by 258 AD, it was death by execution. There were other persecutions dealing with this, but that was the one we'll talk about today. Lots of Christians lost their lives because of that. It's our confession that Jesus is Lord and there is no other. Sometimes that goes counter to our culture, counter to what people want us to say. But it is my agreement that God's plan from the foundation of the world is good, is true, and is for me. Ephesians 1:4 says this, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight." As I commit to this simple confession that Jesus is Lord, I am saying, God, your plan from the beginning is the plan I want for my life. And it is good. And when I confess my sole allegiance to Jesus Christ, I believe God comes to me. It's that place where I can meet God, where I experience him. And as I experience God, he brings change to my life. Thirdly, our confession, probably more the confession that we think about when we think about confession, is the admission of our weakness. I invite you to watch this video.
The Super Bowl without the express written consent of NFL football. Confession. I told my wife that those pants didn't make her look fat. Confession. I filled out a faith promise form last year. That's all I did. Confession. I told my boss, you can't even tell it's a hairpiece. I told my mother-in-law I loved her. Confession. The caller ID said it was the pastor. So I let the machine pick it up. Confession. I told my wife that the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition is an important part of my magazine collection. Confession. I did the 40 Days of Purpose in a week and a half. I never read Prayer of Jabez. I bought the Cliff Notes version of the Bible. Confession. I cry at movies. I've never seen Forrest Gump. Darth Vader is Luke's father. In The Sixth Sense, Bruce Willis is dead. Rosebud is the sled. I can't stand American Idol. Confession. My wife is right 9 times out of 10. Confession. I really didn't believe it was butter. I wore white after Labor Day. Confession. I returned something after I wore it for a week. It was socks. Confession. I told my wife that I go to Hooters because it has good food there. I have a MySpace account. I'm allergic to anchovies. Confession. Buy now and receive a gift pack with a free umbrella of grace. Confession. I just wrote this skit 10 minutes ago. Confession.
All right, kind of a humorous looking confession there. How many have ever been on a job interview and they ask you, what is a weakness you deal with? Or what are some weaknesses in your life? Anybody ever have that happen? Do you know how 70